Hey everybody, I wanted to go over something that presents one of the critiques of the Keynesian model. And one of the reasons why a monetarist or neoclassicists might think about the idea that the Keynesian model would present some challenges. And so that thing we're going to look at today is called the loanable funds market. All right. Let's get a little background about why we need to care about the loanable funds market. The reason we need to care about it is because in the Keynesian world, the government is going to be the spender of last resort in a recession. But the idea, of course, is because they are in a recession, tax receipts are going to be low because of limited economic activity. And so, in order to be the spender of last resort, the government is going to have to borrow money in the economy in order to do the spending that they are going to do to promote economic activity. All right? So, that is sort of the baseline for where we're going here, is the idea that in order to spend the money to be the spender of last resort, the government has to borrow that money to spend it. So, where are they going to get that money? That's a totally valid question. Well, they are going to get it from people who are going to loan them those dollars, right? And there's a couple different ways to think about this. The first way we're going to think about it is that there is broadly and generally a group of people out there who want to borrow money and a group of people out there who want to save money. All right? In our model here, what we're looking at is the supply curve is the group of people that want to save money. They are putting money in banks, they are depositing it, they are the people that are offering the funds to be loaned. Okay? So our supply curve, in essence, would be our savers. All right? And our demand curve, in this case, who demands loanable funds? That's going to be our borrowers. And so we have our savers and our borrowers that come together, and we have a market that exists as a result of borrowers and savers coming together, right? The supply curve is upsloping because the higher the real interest rate goes, the more likely it is that people will want to save their money rather than spend it. It becomes more lucrative to save at higher interest rates than it does at low interest rates. And on the borrowing side, it's just the opposite. It becomes much cheaper to borrow money at lower real interest rates. We can think of an interest rate as the price of using someone else's money. That's what interest rates are. So the reason we use a real interest rate here is because we want to think about the interest rate relative to inflation. That's really what we're looking at here, okay? So it's the interest rate relative to inflation. Now, in this particular model, we have an equilibrium scenario that is created with our savers and our borrowers coming together in our marketplace for loanable funds. In the Keynesian world, when the economy goes into a recession, a demand-deficient recession, what you are going to find is that the Keynesians argue that the government should step in and be the spender of last resort and go do the spending that no one else will do. Okay, so in this particular version of the model, what you have is you have one group of borrowers and one group of spenders, and they're all sort of vying for the same pile of money, all right? And so what you're going to see is you're going to see the entrance of the government into this marketplace as a rightward shift of the demand curve, okay? The government comes in and they compete with other borrowers for money. You can think of it this way. and we get, sure, a greater quantity of funds loaned out, but, okay, we have a trade-off of a higher rate of interest. All right? Now, the reason this is called the crowding out effect is it's the idea that since the government is stepping in to borrow money, they are in competition with private borrowers. And the government stepping in to borrow that money and driving up those real interest rates crowds out private investment. And if we remember from our world of micro, allocative efficiency generally tends to happen when we allow markets to do the work that they're supposed to do, and government engagement and government interventions often will lead to inefficiencies in the marketplace because the government overwhelmingly likely will not allocate those resources to society's most desired uses. So when we see this rise in real interest rates as the government steps in to borrow additional funds, what you're going to do is you're going to drive private investment out of the marketplace and make it less likely that private interests will drive the economy and more likely that government interests will drive the economy. Generally speaking, we like to think of that as a little bit inefficient. So this is one way to model the crowding out effect, which is an increase in demand as government steps in to borrow money. All right. There's actually another way that we often think about the crowding out effect in the loanable funds market. And in this particular market, in this particular thought process, what we're going to see is you sort of think of loanable funds in two different ways, okay? So one, you think of a private market for loanable funds where businesses and savers come together. And it is definitely the government is not engaged in that marketplace at all. And the second part would be the public version of the market. And in the public version of the market, the government is the only actor that's doing the borrowing, okay? So basically what you think of is these loanable funds now are not one giant pile of loanable funds where everybody's competing for them. There's a private market pile and there's a public market pile. And that's a different way to sort of think about this. But what you have to think about is that every dollar that heads over to the public market to be borrowed by the government is a dollar that cannot be in the private market for loanable funds at that point and cannot be borrowed by businesses. The outcome is strikingly similar, but it's just a different way to sort of think about the world of loanable funds. And if we think about it in this particular perspective, when you see dollars, and why wouldn't I use green here? When you see dollars moving from the private market into the public market, what you are going to see as a result of that is you are going to see in this crowding out in the loanable funds market, if this is the private version of this, where businesses go and consumers go to borrow money, you're going to see money flowing out of that marketplace because it's going into the public marketplace. The government is borrowing those dollars instead of the private firms. And so we get a leftward shift of our loanable fund supply curve. And this shows a little more clearly the idea of a rising real interest rate for sure. Same exact outcome that we had last time. And in this case, what we're seeing is in the private marketplace for loanable funds, we're seeing a decrease in that quantity of loanable funds, which is an indication that the government is doing the investing and the firms are not. And once again, that's one of those places where we like to think about allocative efficiency really happening through the world of private spending and letting prices determine the best direction for resources to go. So that was two different ways that we can think about the crowding out effect. And remember to tie that into the world of the Keynesian model, where the government is going to be the spender of last resort, and therefore they're going to need to borrow the money to do it and crowd out private investment. Thanks.